Behold the majesté and race that is France. Liberté, fraternité, égalité. Describing France to non-Europeans is tough. Imagine what would happen if you took the aggressive tendencies of the United States, added that to an Aussie's natural distrust of authority, and then coated it all in a unique local tendency to riot at the drop of a hat. There are bits of French culture that make Donald Trump look like a lefty, and there are bits which are lifted quite literally from Mao's Little Red Book. France has always done things its own way, often with a panache and verve far beyond any stolid Brit or unimaginative German. For example, in 1881, Gustave Trouvé built the world's first car, an incredible achievement, to be sure. He created a vehicle capable of transporting a person at a reasonable speed under its own power from point A to point B before anybody else. But of course, this being France, it had three wheels and used not a sensible power source like a combustion engine, but instead an electric battery that got hot enough to boil water, and as there was no national grid or really any electricity generation in France at the time, it was almost useless as a practical device for transportation. Subsequent French cars have all had their own unique and often inexplicable design features. As a child, my mum had France's answer to the VW Beetle, a Citroën 2 Chevaux or 2CV. It weighed slightly less than an unladen shopping trolley, which would have made it great fun, but sadly it had the engine with all the grunt of an anemic neckbeard faced with the outdoors for the first time, sporting a massive 29 brake horsepower. It could, if really pushed, get to a top speed of about 55 miles an hour. Unfortunately, trucks in the UK can do 60 miles an hour, so the trick on motorways was to try and backdraft behind one and hope no side winds pushed you off the road. When it rained, and it rains all the time in the UK, the electrics would switch off, including the windscreen wipers, which would mean that the driver had to manually operate the dash-mounted gearbox, the steering wheel, the pedals, and also the windscreen wiper handle. Nonetheless, it was, despite the occasional attempt to kill you or turn itself off, or both, immensely fun and full of character. In short, it was a good analogy for France itself. Contradictory, confusing, illogical, and so nearly brilliant. The country is vast. It's actually the largest in Europe if you discount Russia and the Ukraine, and it has borders with, well, basically everybody. Spain, Italy, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Belgium, and of course, Germany. Ooh, Germany. The other reason I love France, aside from the cheese, the wine, the climate, the beautiful people, the cars, the chaos, and the sheer bloody-mindedness of the place, is of course that they are our natural enemies. For the better part of 1,000 years, Britain and France, or the states that became those things, have made glorious and bloody war on one another. Anglo-French War has broken out something like 30 times, and that doesn't even count the 7 times between 1803 and 1815 when we declared war on one another. Up until 1870, there were more British people buried in France than any other foreign country in the world, which, if you remember that Britain ruled America and India, is quite a statistic. It was a rivalry that was quite bloody, but also, frankly, largely ineffectual. Some colonies changed hands a few times, but actual invasion of the home countries was quite limited. The Normans, who were kind of sort of proto-French, but really mostly Viking, invaded and held England famously in 1066. I'm not sure that really counts. More successfully, Queen Isabella of France did invade in 1326 alongside Roger Mortimer, who set himself up as regent. I think that's probably one for France. They did take the Isle of Wight in 1545, but honestly no one cared, so everyone went home in the end. England and Wales, of course, have had several pops during the 100 Years' War. It went less than well, but we did give it a solid go, and it ended with English troops being kicked out finally in 1558 when Calais fell. I'd like to claim that the British Army successfully invaded France in 1814 and chucked old Boney off the throne, but we had a little help from one or two other countries. More precisely, we had help from Russia, Prussia, Spain, Mecklenburg, Portugal, Sardinia, Sicily, Austria, Bavaria, Baden, Liechtenstein, Saxony, Württemberg, the Netherlands and Denmark. So, frankly, that doesn't really count either. One could argue then that in nearly 1,000 years of on-again, off-again fighting, the score is 2-1 to France. You'd have to squint a bit. Really, it's a score draw. All these fun and games have brought to formal halt in 1904 with the signing of the Entente Cordiale, when we both agreed that basically we would leave one another alone. 119 years later, it's still in force. It's one of the longest standing treaties in the world. But one might ask, what changed to make the French and the British play nicely with one another after 10 centuries of mutual slaughter? The answer was, of course, Germany. Now, the bits of German history that aren't about starting 2 world wars are short, frenetic, complicated, and very, very interesting. If I'm honest, I was going to go into some of this in a bit of detail. I started and then I realised, bluntly, I don't really understand it, so I ran away like the coward I am. If you want to know more, Carter Hoyer has a brilliant book called Blood and Iron. I highly recommend it. It's brilliant. I need to sit down and read it again. Anyway, the point is that France in 1904 knew exactly what Germany was capable of because of events 30 years previously. It was there involuntarily when the German Empire, the First Reich, had been created. So let's go back a bit. Let's go back specifically to the early 1800s. A lot of defeated colonial powers before and since have struggled with the idea of what to do when they've lost. And so it was with France at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1816. It had a series of short-lived governments of various kinds as old Bonapartists, republicans, monarchists and other assorted types attempted to seize power. Two notable attempts to seize power were made in 1836 and then again in 1840 by one Charles-Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. These attempts went as badly as they possibly could, the first being stopped by a local garrison which at least was armed, and the second when his party was stopped on the beach en masse and arrested by the local customs officer. Because they were drunk. Très gallique. Anyway, a quick side note. Strictly speaking, this dude is called Louis Napoleon to differentiate him from his dad, Louis Bonaparte, brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, and to try and avoid confusing either of them with Louis-Philippe I, who was Louis Napoleon was trying to overthrow, and who was confusingly son of Louis-Philippe II, who was Duc d'Orléans. Seriously, you couldn't make this shit up. There are at least 17 people called Louis who ruled France at one point or another, and I'm not going to add to the problem, so Louis Napoleon will for henceforth be known as Charles, okay? Anyway, Charles was not good being a revolutionary, but he was quite lucky. Although he wound up in jail and in exile on multiple occasions, no one shot or hung him whilst he was trying to become a committed revolutionary, and he stuck at it until 1848, when the explosion of revolutions tore across Europe. And as the dust settled in France, Charles found himself president with a 92% approval rating. Sure, I totally believe that number. Whatever. Unfortunately, Charles didn't believe in democracy at all, something which became blindingly obvious when he changed his title from president to prince president. It came as no great shock then, in 1851, that he launched a coup d'etat and began furiously rebuilding the empire with himself as emperor. And he built all sorts of stuff: railways, coal mines, a navy, vast swathes of Paris, and of course, inevitably, a modern army. This scared the living shit out of France's neighbours, who'd only just got used to his uncle's jaunts across the continent, having stopped 30 years before. After 8 years of preparation, Charles had his modern army and immediately set about using it, further scaring the crap out of everyone. He sent it to the Crimean War, then a war in Italy, and then weirdly a war in Mexico in the 1860s, whilst the Yanks were having that minor disagreement amongst themselves. Until they weren't anymore, when the French army gloriously ran away. It's a pretty funny story, but it's a tangent too far for today. We'll come back to it. He'd also spent a goodly amount of time playing politics on the basis that France was the premier power in Europe and everybody should show some goddamn respect, which was unfortunate as he really wasn't very good at playing politics and everyone began to hate him, with the possible exception of Britain. All of this warmongering and plotting took a lot out of poor old Charles, and after about 10 years or so, he was a pretty ill man. He was increasingly out of touch with his people and out of touch with European politics. So it came as a hell of a shock when, in 1864, Prussia, under Wilhelm I and his Chancellor Bismarck, went to war with their neighbour Austria. Everybody assumed that this was going to take months, if not years, to win. The reality was that Prussia wiped the floor with Austria in less than 8 weeks. Suddenly, France had a 300-mile border with a collection of the most highly militarized states in the world under a unified leadership. Worse still, Charles had signed 2 pacts just prior to the war, one with Austria and one with Prussia, and now that the war was over, Prussia and its allies were asking a lot of difficult questions like, where the fuck were you? And what the fuck did you agree with Austria before the war began? And this might have been okay, but France was shit out of allies. They'd pissed everybody off. Not least, of course, the Austrians, who realised that the French had dicked them over. And should Prussia decide to go to the west and attack France, the Austrians weren't exactly going to throw themselves in the way. By 1870, though, Charles thought he'd ridden out the storm. So when one of Spain's many succession crises kicked off later that year, he had the brilliant idea of getting involved. Spain had been France's kryptonite many times, and so it proved again in 1870. Unable to accept that France wasn't the supreme power in Europe, Charles foolishly weighed in, demanding his candidate took the Spanish throne. And when Bismarck put his candidate forward, Charles felt his honour had been impinged and declared war on the Northern German Confederation. This was such a dick move. It was precisely, though, what Bismarck was banking on and what Bismarck was ready for. Prussia and its allies had an army more than twice the size of France's. It was better equipped, it was better trained, it was better led, it had better logistics, better communications, a clear mobilisation plan and a clear strategic objective. France had none of these things. Prussia moved more than 500,000 men en bloc to a 120-kilometre long front with France within days. Meanwhile, the French managed to mobilise less than half that many and scatter them across the frontier with Germany, seemingly at random. And here we begin to see what will become a depressingly familiar set of behaviours and circumstances that would dog France for the next 100 years. It started with an advance. It would always start with an advance. In 1870, they got a massive 10 kilometres into the German Confederation and seized Saarbrücken, inflicting a devastating 80 casualties on the enemy, who weren't there but instead concentrating further to the north. In August 1914, the 1st and 2nd French armies would attempt precisely the same move, but from further back because, spoilers, they lost the War of 1870 and they lost most of their eastern frontier at the same time. It didn't matter that they were further back because, again, the Germans were concentrating to the north. In September 1939, French forces would charge a huge 5 miles across exactly the same ground to Saarbrücken, and the Germans would be concentrating, well, actually, okay, in that case, they weren't concentrating in the north, they were concentrating in Poland, but whatever. The point is, French armies were a bit like a late summer wasp. In theory, they have a big sting and are all gnarly, but in reality, they fly towards rotting apples like Saarland, stop, get pissed, and get stomped on by a German jackboot. Karl von Clausewitz, father of the German schools of tactics, and indeed all European military tactics in the early 1800s, said, "The best strategy is always to be strong, first in general and then at the decisive point. There is no higher and simpler law of strategy than keeping one's forces concentrated." In Germany, this concept is called the Schwerpunkt. This is where a German army puts all of its forces into a limited area and uses that local superiority to overwhelm and destroy the opposition. See also 1815 at Waterloo, 1914 at the start of World War I, 1940 at the start of World War II, 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, 1944 in the Ardennes, and so on. In 1870, the Northern German Confederation did this 5 times in 3 weeks at Wissembourg, at Schweidach, at Worth, at Metz, and then finally at Sedan. The trick is speed and firepower at the cutting edge of your enemy and a flexible enough supply chain to support it in the field for a relatively short period of time. Blitzkrieg is just a fancy name for sparkling Schwerpunkt. By the 2nd of September, the whole French force at Sedan had been captured, including Charles, along with 104,000 of his men, and really that was it for the French Empire. The Third Republic was declared, Charles lost his throne, and at the end of October, 170,000 men besieged in Metz surrendered too. There was still another 7 months of fighting to go, but the stuffing had been knocked out of France in less than 4 weeks. In January 1871, with the siege of Paris nearing its conclusion, the German Empire was born as a nation, being declared and signed into existence at, of all places, the Palace of Versailles. Not the last time a treaty that affected Europe would be signed there. So, that went very badly for the French, and hence 30 years later, now facing the German Empire on its border, they signed with the British. Of course, that's not the end of the story. Simply signing the Entente Cordiale did not end things, and peace did not reign in Europe forever after. At pretty much the same moment that the British and the French were having a little sit down and a think, so was the German High Command. If Sedan is so lovely, and we need to get there fast, why are we pissing around going around Belgium when there's this bloody obvious shortcut? Belgium has the defensive capabilities of wet cardboard, and we have the finest military in the world. What if we just march there, The Ardennes Forest didn't have many roads, for sure, but they didn't particularly care because they had awesome logistics. And so it was when things began to finally boil over in 1914, the cream of the German army curb-stomped the Belgian army and swept across their southern borders, headed towards Sedan. Again. It's largely forgotten in Britain today, but this opening phase of World War I was one of the bloodiest of the entire war. Between the declaration of war on the 28th of July and the battle on the Marne, where the Germans were finally stopped on the 5th of September, perhaps 800,000 men were killed or wounded. It was like the first day of the Somme, only every day for 8 weeks. French military dressed in bright blue uniforms, their officers wielding swords and wearing capes, not helmets, led bayonet charges across open fields into murderous fire of machine guns and artillery. Both sides were convinced that the offensive spirit was the key to victory, but they were facing armies bigger and better armed than anything that anybody had ever encountered before, and it was a slaughter on a gargantuan scale. After a while, both sides were forced to dig in, and that's where trench warfare that we associate with World War I began. Crucially, however, the Germans hadn't taken Paris and would eventually be defeated. So I guess 1-1? I mean, to be honest, knowing that Britain had tried for nearly 1,000 years and it had cost the lives of 20 million men last time, if I was the German High Command, I would have just stopped there. But unfortunately, some jumped-up Austrian corporal had other ideas. By the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, with Germany increasingly looking like a basket case, France was worried that something might happen and trigger another war. So they began to reinforce their frontier with a project called the Maginot Line, dreamt up by the Minister of Defence from 1928 to 1931, André Maginot. Now, here is where we come across a truly Gallic bit of thinking. I imagine the scene somewhere in the Palais d'Orsay went something like this. Raymond, I think we should build ourselves a big wall with a lot of guns to stop Le Boche this time. Ah, bien sûr, André, une bonne idée. But we are a little broke now because the bloody Americans have crashed the economy. We can only afford 450 kilometers of fortifications. Zut alors, Raymond, but which of our borders should we build it on? Well, André, Les Allemands is right there. Let us build it facing them. Bon. Except it occurs to me that last time they came through the Ardennes and they have a lot of tanks, so what if they do that again? Oh, do not be so stupid, André. Tanks cannot possibly cross the Ardennes. En plus, the Germans would never invade Belgium twice. There is fuck all in Sedan. Why would they go there a third time? Sadly, the Germans did want to go to Sedan again, through Belgium again, and they bypassed all the pretty forts that André had so carefully built, because they could be bypassed very easily. You know what, there's a bridge just outside of Sedan where the German army crossed the Meuse River in 1815, in 1817, and again in 1914. And you know what, if in 1928 I was building 280 miles of heavy fortifications and forts, I would start by making sure that that crossing was covered by barbed wire, machine guns, mines, artillery. I'd make sure that the Air Force had practiced bombing it every Tuesday for the past 20 years. I'd put it on staff maps, I'd have observation posts nearby with radio on it, and I don't know, maybe I'd stick all of my tank formations within an easy 10-minute drive of that point. Sadly, the French, being the French, put an observation post but didn't man it because the day that the Germans came was their day off. I'm not kidding. And they assumed that the Germans would take ages to concentrate because it took the French ages to concentrate, so it'd all be fine. Which is precisely how things had gone to shit in 1870 and again in 1914. I mean, my dudes, what the fuck? In fairness, they did look at the roads through the Ardennes, and they assumed that only a nut job would try and push 40,000 vehicles down just 4 main roads there, which, you know, like, not that unreasonable. However, you might want to just check, I don't know, maybe mount some kind of air reconnaissance to make sure, but they didn't. So Rommel and Guderian did push 40,000 vehicles down those 4 roads, and they didn't get bombed once, despite having tailbacks that went on for 48 hours. Not a single bomb fell. They did get spotted, but by the RAF, who, when they reported what they'd seen to French HQ, were ignored as being oversensitive, hysterical Brits. And so that went really well. My point, if there is one, is that if the EU goes to shit and the Germans look all aggressive again, if you're French, I would maybe, let's not bother defending Paris. Let's just protect Sedan. If you're Belgian, I would suggest stocking up on beer and chocolate and learning to live underground. And if you're German, I suggest invading through Switzerland. The French will never see that coming.